I always wanted to get the Purple Heart. This was much easier.
Trump stumps for votes in Virginia.
I think the Republican nominee is unfit to serve as president.
And the president weighs in on the Republican nominee. Key trade partner in Asia, the Obama administration seeks stronger ties with Singapore. The role of women. Pope Francis launches a study of the history of female deacons in the early church. And pop art in the West Bank. Can a new image bring hope to Bethlehem? Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, August 2nd, 2016. Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. Donald Trump, reacting to President Obama's claim that he's unfit to lead the nation, accuses Obama of failed leadership. Jason Calvi is with the Trump campaign in Virginia and begins our political coverage tonight. Jason?
Brian, a Republican Party leader here in Ashburn, says winning the state of Virginia is absolutely critical to winning the White House. And you can see that in the schedule. Donald Trump here today, his running mate Mike Pence on Thursday. Republican presidential candidates have won this state since 1968, with two exceptions, Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. People lined up since 5:30 this morning to hear Donald Trump speak at a public school in Ashburn.
He's a business person, and I think we need a business person to get us out of the mess we're in.
But protesters gathered outside, some ejected inside, had shirts that said Islam peace. With much at stake in this swing state, the Republican nominee is offering his enemies a reason to vote for him.
Even if you can't stand Donald Trump, you think Donald Trump is the worst, you're going to vote for me. You know why? Justices of the Supreme Court.
The Homeschool Legal Defense Association's Will Estrada is the Republican Party chair for Loudoun County. Backstage, he gave Trump a few tips.
As I said, first thing, you got to come back here. This is great being here in Loudoun County. Keep coming back. That helps us get our message out.
That's why Jeanette Thompson and her undecided husband Rodney came out.
I need to hear some plan of action, less rhetoric, less chants, and more, layout of plans on how he's going to go about doing a lot of the stuff that he's promising.
Today, a veteran gave Trump a Purple Heart. It comes amid a controversy over Trump's criticism of the family of a slain soldier.
I always wanted to get the Purple Heart. This was much easier. But I tell you, it was such an honor.
Some of Trump's lighthearted remarks produced double takes. When he was interrupted by a crying baby, he joked around.
Don't worry about that baby. I love babies. So actually, I was only kidding. You can get the baby out of here.
And Brian, I wasn't able to check if the mother brought the baby out or if possibly the baby fell asleep. From here in Virginia, Donald Trump is heading to another swing state. Tomorrow he'll be in Florida, and then he heads to Maine. Brian?
Jason Calvi with the Trump campaign in Virginia. Thank you. And more on President Obama's criticism of Trump from our chief White House correspondent and political director, Lauren Ashburn.
Brian, in a stunning rebuke to Donald Trump's criticism of Muslim parents of a fallen soldier, President Obama calls Trump unfit to be president and says Trump keeps proving it. And he questions Republican leaders who continue to say they'll vote for him.
If you are repeatedly having to say in very strong terms that what he has said is unacceptable, why are you still endorsing him? What does this say about your party that this is your standard bearer?
Obama says Trump doesn't appear to have basic knowledge of critical international issues and that he's woefully unprepared to do the job. Speaker Paul Ryan and Senator John McCain are among the Republicans who have rejected Donald Trump's comments. The president's remarks were made here today, while for the first time in 30 years, the Prime Minister of Singapore is visiting. The focus of his trip is to boost the controversial Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership.
The Republic of Singapore.
Singapore is one of the 12 nations in the TPP, negotiated by the Obama administration. Neither presidential candidate supports it.
Right now, I'm president, and I'm for it.
The president warned that to pull up a drawbridge on the partnership 7 years in the making would only hurt the United States and its workers.
We got to get some things from other places and Our export sector is a huge contributor to jobs and our economic well-being.
We are near the finish line, and we hope that the countries, particularly the U.S., will be able to ratify the TPP as soon as possible.
At today's rally, Donald Trump once again opposed the agreement designed to wipe out tariffs. Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton also opposes the TPP, although in the past few days, one of her advisors said she would be for it when president. It's a claim she denies. Brian, back to you.
All right, thank you. White House correspondent Lauren Ashburn. The Democratic National Committee's chief executive steps down, along with two others. Amy Dacey's resignation comes in the wake of the DNC's most recent controversy. Hacked emails revealed party favoritism for Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders. Chief Finance Officer Brad Marshall and Communications Director Luis Miranda also quit today. DNC Chair Debbie Wasserman Schultz resigned just before last week's convention. Hillary Clinton's fundraising reaches a new high. She's now ahead of where President Obama was just 4 years ago. Clinton reports raising $63 million for her campaign last month. You tack on another $26 million she raised in July for the Democratic National Committee as well as state parties. Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump said he raised $35.8 million in small donations last month. Today, he promised to continue writing checks to his own campaign, exceeding $100 million by Election Day. Other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. Eradicating mosquitoes in a part of Miami where 14 people appear to have contracted the Zika virus is extremely challenging. So says the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Dr. Tom Frieden.
What we've seen in this particular neighborhood is a large number of infections and continued presence of the particular mosquito that spreads the Zika virus. And because of that, we think that pregnant women shouldn't travel there. Pregnant women who live or work there should do everything possible to avoid mosquito bites.
Frieden says mosquito control is difficult in the neighborhood because it has industrial, commercial, and residential development. The mosquito that carries the Zika virus is also generally very difficult to eradicate. A bus crash on a Central California freeway kills 5, sending at least 5 other people to hospitals. The California Highway Patrol gave no details about additional injuries or the cause of the accident. The bus was en route from Southern California to Sacramento and it crashed early today between the cities of Atwater and Livingston. It hit a highway exit sign pole that appears to have torn through the middle of the bus. About 30 passengers were on board at the time. Vice President Joe Biden officiates at a civil marriage for a same-sex couple. That ceremony was held Monday afternoon at the Naval Observatory, the vice president's official residence. The White House says the 2 longtime White House aides asked Biden for this favor. Biden, who is Catholic, publicly backed so-called gay marriage as early as 4 years ago. Father Jacques Hamel tried to push away his attackers with his feet, saying, "Go away, Satan." That revelation from the Archbishop of Rouen at today's solemn funeral mass underscores the horror of last week's murder at the altar. Hundreds of clergy filled Rouen Cathedral today, remembering the 85-year-old parish priest. Father Hamel's murder during morning mass sent shockwaves around the world. The Archbishop invites people to return to churches on August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, to pray that violence will not take over in their hearts. The Italian Coast Guard rescues hundreds more migrants off the coast of Libya Monday. This dramatic video shows the migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea in rubber dinghies. They've now been safely taken to Sicily. According to the Italian Coast Guard, around 1,800 migrants were rescued on Monday. Nearly 100,000 refugees have reached the Italian coast by sea this year. Pope Francis follows through on a promise, instituting a new commission for the study of women deacons. Several months ago, before a group of religious sisters, the Pope expressed a willingness to consider forming a commission to study women deacons, such as they existed in the early church. There's been absolutely no sign from the Vatican of any change in the doctrine that only men may be ordained to the priesthood. Our Rome producer Mary Shovlin can tell us more about this new commission. Mary, who is on the commission and what is its mission?
Well, leading the commission is the Vatican's #2 in charge of doctrine, so from the CDF. He's leading this commission, which is made up of 6 men and 6 women. Among the women, we have a mix between lay and religious members, and all of the men on the commission are clerics. And they all come from academic backgrounds, all experts in doctrine, if you will, very scholarly group. So I think the focus here is going to be doctrinal and scholarly, really looking at the historical foundations of the female diaconate in the early church, because this is what Pope Francis said he wanted to look into when he made this promise to the sisters back in May.
What might this commission find that we don't already know about deacons, female deacons in the early church?
Well, Pope Francis pointed out in that May meeting with the religious, he said there have been so many publications on female deaconesses in the early church, but not a clear picture has emerged. So I think all we're going to see is a further deepening of this study on what their role was in the early church and what exactly they did, why it existed, and then also maybe why it was, in a sense, phased out. Of course, they don't exist today. So I think there's just going to be a deepening of that knowledge.
Can this be seen, though, as a step toward possibly ordaining women as deacons?
Not at all, Brian. I reached out to the Holy See press office for an answer to this very question, and they referred me to 2 remarks. One by Father Lombardi the day just after Pope Francis made these comments. And he said in no way was he even saying he wanted to ordain female deacons, and much less was he saying this was a step towards female ordination. So they were already striking down that argument. He also pointed to Pope Francis's own words on his trip back from Armenia, in which he was asked about this. And the Pope said the next day, he said it was if the church had already opened the door to this possibility of having ordained female deacons. And the Pope himself said, not at all. So I think if we take Pope Francis's words, don't expect anything in that regard from this commission.
We'll be watching the commission's work, and I know you'll be helping us with that. Mary Shovelin, our own producer. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Brian.
And Pope Francis is deeply concerned that children are being taught in schools that gender can be a choice. He expressed his concern during a private meeting with Polish bishops during his pilgrimage last week. The Vatican released a transcript today. The Pope blames what he calls ideological colonizing backed by very influential countries. Coming up, troublesome signs in Syria, and the war on terror expands in Libya, how the U.S. military mission is changing. And papal art, what makes this picture of the Pope different? Thank you for joining us for EWTN News Nightly on this Tuesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. Airstrikes kill at least 20 people, including 8 children, in and around Aleppo, Syria. These are the latest victims of that country's civil war. Meanwhile, U.S.-backed Kurdish forces make gains in northern Syria. They're retaking parts of an area that's been held by ISIS. The latest advance by the Syrian Democratic Forces opens the way for civilians to evacuate the town. U.S. airstrikes against ISIS terrorists in Libya continue for a second day. President Obama says the campaign is vital to U.S. national security and will continue for as long as necessary. He says the airstrikes were requested by internationally backed authorities in Libya. This operation signals the start of a more intense American role in the fight against ISIS in North Africa. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Waltz is an Afghanistan war veteran, wrote Warrior Diplomat, a Green Berets battle from Washington to Afghanistan. Mike, these are called precision airstrikes. What does that mean? What are they?
Well, most of the fighting that's going on in Libya right now is around the town of Sirte, a very dense, heavily populated area. So what the Air Force will be using are much smaller bombs, much smaller munitions, and sending in very targeted strikes, typically called in by our special operators on the ground, to only hit very specific locations rather than kind of a broader bombing effort.
Explain the geographic role that Libya plays in this battle against ISIS.
I think what we're seeing is really an expansion and a shifting of strategy from the ISIS leadership. And rather than consolidating and trying to expand its gains in Syria and Iraq, we're seeing it expand more globally, from Afghanistan to the Egyptian Sinai and now to Libya. You also have the key aspect of Libya as a major oil producer in North Africa.
What's behind the timing, though, of these airstrikes in Libya this week?
As the president mentioned in his press remarks, the internationally backed unity government in Libya requested the support. What he didn't mention is they've been requesting our support for quite some time, including a number of the militias that we backed in the overthrow of Gaddafi. So the situation has been deteriorating in Libya quite a bit and for quite some time into civil war. ISIS has taken advantage of it, and I welcome to see us get more engaged and try to stabilize the situation.
How engaged do you think will we get? Is there a possibility of ground troops?
Well, on the one hand, there already are ground troops. It's publicly acknowledged that we have special operators from the United States and from the French and the British on the ground helping these various kind of Western-aligned militias. I don't think you will see divisions of hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops. The Libyans don't want that, and nor is there an appetite in the United States.
So we're in the middle of an election here. There is going to be a change at the top, the commander-in-chief. How does that play into all this?
Well, I think you're going to see the new commander-in-chief certainly be tested, not only by ISIS, but by the Russians, the Chinese, and others. But as it relates to the war on terrorism, we need a longer-term strategy. How are we going to defeat this idea of Islamic extremism over the next, what I think are going to be multiple generations?
As someone who has served in Afghanistan and here in Washington, what are your biggest concerns going into this transition now?
Well, again, the fact that we haven't really learned over the last 15 years, I think a lot of the lessons that we should have since 9/11, a lot of that gets lost as we change out administrations. Folks come in with new, fresh ideas, but we haven't really built on that cumulative effort over time. So that's my concern in any transition. And then again, we have to stop thinking in 4-year presidential cycles and begin thinking like our enemies do, which are in generations and in decades.
Lieutenant Colonel Michael Waltz, we appreciate your unique perspective. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
A group of artists hopes a new image in the biblical West Bank town of Bethlehem sparks a wave of new hope for their region. A spray-painted image of Pope Francis now graces the wall built by Israel, separating Bethlehem from Jerusalem. The artists say their intention is to enshrine the Holy Father's 2014 visit to the city where Jesus was born. Daniel Banura, a 29-year-old resident of Bethlehem, is behind the art project.
The wall has become a symbol of injustice and evil and violence in Palestine. So the idea behind this project is that to bring hope and love into what we see here. So we are hoping and praying that love would overcome hate and peace would overcome violence and truth would overcome falsehood.
Pope Francis briefly prayed at the wall. His gesture deeply touched Palestinians. The artists say they want the world to know about the injustices they see here.
North American Christians just don't know that in Bethlehem there's a wall, and that even the Pope came and prayed on the wall to speak up against it, to say that this is unjust. So I think that story needs to be told with the world. And sometimes street art tells stories.
The wall is part of a massive barrier Israel began building in 2002 in response to a wave of deadly suicide bombings carried out by Palestinians. Israel says it needs the wall for its security, but critics argue that it fuels divisions.
Nice, there's some white on there.
These artists hope the image of Pope Francis will inspire tourists and pilgrims to think about his message.
He had a famous quote where he said that we should be building bridges instead of walls. And that was his message. And I'm hoping that pilgrims, tourists, everyone around the world feels that message and speaks up for it.
Up next, remembering a seminarian who gave his life to save another. And U.S. Olympic runners, their unique path to the Summer Games. Pope Francis challenged World Youth Day pilgrims to leave their mark on history, saying, following Jesus demands a good dose of courage, a readiness to trade in the sofa for a pair of walking shoes and set out on new and uncharted paths. Thanks for joining us this Tuesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. A young Italian pilgrim died of meningitis after attending World Youth Day. The Italian Bishops' Conference says the girl from Rome died at a Vienna hospital as she traveled home from Poland. The Bishops' Conference says anyone who used the same hospitality facilities should get vaccinated. Pilgrims traveling with her already received the vaccine. The body of a missing Wichita seminarian is finally recovered in the Arkansas River. Kayaking with friends last month, 24-year-old Brian Burkamp was swept away helping another kayaker who had fallen into the rain-swollen river. Burkamp had finished his second year of seminary and would have been ordained a priest in 2018. More than 1,000 people attended his July memorial mass in Kansas. Father John Trigilio, co-host of EWTN's Web of Faith, is formation advisor and spiritual director for Mount St. Mary's Seminary, joining us by Skype from Marysville, Pennsylvania. Father, how did you know Brian?
I knew Brian because, first of all, he came up to my parish every Monday for his apostolate, which we technically call his pastoral field education assignment. And he would come and visit the sick at our nursing homes and the shut-ins. And then after his visit, we'd have a discussion, have a meal together. And then, of course, I saw him 3 days a week when I was at the seminary.
So you knew him quite well. You attended his memorial mass. How do you think he'll be remembered?
I think he'll be remembered as the young man that he always was, very affable, very devout, very friendly, and very well-grounded. I mean, he came from a modest farm out in Wichita. He was one of 8 children, very devoted to his family, but just an all-around good, solid guy.
Scripture tells us there is no greater love than one who lays down his life for another. So for those mourning his loss, is it consoling that he died, saving another person?
Oh, I think so. I mean, the shock of his death is only comforted by the fact that, as his bishop mentioned at the memorial mass, he died in a priestly way. I mean, the essence of the priesthood is sacrifice, and he gave his life to save someone.
He was only in his mid-20s. Losing someone that young comes as a shock to so many people. How are you pastoring the seminarians there as they continue their formation?
Well, what I'm trying to do is what I did when I had a brother who died at the age of 33 from a drunk driver accident, and I tell them, you know, as Father Benedict Rochelle wrote in his book, faith doesn't give us all the answers, but does give us the strength to live with unanswered questions. And we just have to do the best we can, persevere, and certainly believe that there's a place and destiny for us with the Lord if we die being true disciples, which I'm confident that's what Brian was.
And having known him so well, Father, just give us a picture of this young man and the friendship that you shared.
I mean, always friendly, respectful, but he wasn't in any way, shape, or form to any extreme. He wasn't some super jock that was only into sports, but he certainly was an athlete. He was academic, but he wasn't a nerd. I mean, everybody liked him. Very polite, but very devout. I mean, I would see him often in the chapel praying, and he had great questions, and we had wonderful discussions after he would visit the sick. And I just think his pastoral character came out, even though he still had a few years to go in his studies for the priesthood.
And as sad as it is that he passed away, I'm sure that finding his remains is certainly a final chapter for that family.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Being able to bury his body is going to give some closure to his family, and also, you know, that's a wonderful, one of the corporal works of mercy, of course, and I think it's going to be helpful to the family.
Father John Trigilio from Mount St. Mary's Seminary, thank you so much for being with us, Father.
Thank you.
And as the Summer Olympics open later this week, the U.S. will be represented by 4 unique runners. They are Kenyans who earned American citizenship by serving in the United States Army. When Hillary Bohr joined the U.S. Army, the daily 2-mile run required for soldiers at Fort Carson was easy.
So I ran my 2-mile in 10 minutes, I think it was 10 minutes. For the soldiers, that's really fast.
Bohr came to the U.S. at age 17. He grew up in Kenya, where he loved to play sports, except for one.
For me, personally, I didn't like to run.
But it turns out he excelled at running, becoming an All-American at Iowa State. 10 years later, Bohr is representing his new home country in the steeplechase at the Summer Olympics.
To make the U.S. team, not even the U.S. team, but to represent the Army, it's just a great accomplishment.
Bohr is one of 4 American soldiers of Kenyan descent competing in Rio. They gained citizenship by joining the Army.
It's a pretty humbling moment to think that somebody would want to leave their country and come to yours, and they would do so to a degree in which they would die for something that they haven't even been a part of yet.
The soldiers trained to become Olympians through the world-class athlete program at Fort Carson, commanded by Captain Matthew Hickey.
They're going to represent the United States at the Olympic Games, not just as athletes, but as soldier athletes, and that's about as American as you can get.
Some 3,000 Fort Carson soldiers are now deployed in Afghanistan. Bohr, a financial management technician, had been scheduled to be deployed there, but his older brother Julius, who's in the same unit, went in his place, giving him the chance to chase his dreams.
It's a different feeling and it's not only for my brother, it's just for every soldier that are deployed now.
Hoping to make his family and his country proud. For the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. Good night.